Howdy folks, welcome to Module 2 of the CompTIA A Plus course. As you can see, this is based on the 1200 series of A Plus, and today's module is called Installing Motherboards and Connectors. Now of course, this title alone doesn't tell us everything we need to know about this module, so if you want a more accurate idea of what's going to be in this module, that you can find in the video description down below, with very nice convenience timestamps to help you jump ahead to specific topics if you're just looking for something specific. Now folks, this module consists of 3 main sections today. So everything we'll be covering will be divided between these 3 sections. Now the 3 sections for today is cables and connectors. Now guys, these cables and connectors are not cables and connectors like network cables. No. These are the cables and connectors one would find inside of a computer case. So these will be the cables that connects to your motherboard, your hard drive, those kinds of things. It's the cables that you would find inside of your case. The second main section will be motherboards. Now on its own that sounds pretty vague, so you'll see there's actually a lot of topics inside of that section. And then the third and the last main section for today folks will be legacy cable types. Now for those of you that don't know yet, the word legacy means something is old. This can be old hardware, it can be old software. Software-wise, this can be operating systems, or it can be actual software. So it normally means there's no longer support for it. It's stuff that you're probably going to have a hard time fixing, or you're not going to find spare parts for it, no patches, no updates, that kinds of stuff. So there you have it folks, that is the 3 main sections we'll be diving in today. Now before we jump into that first main section folks, if you haven't done it already, show this video and show the channel some love by giving this video a like. It doesn't just help this video and the channel, it also helps other people out there that cannot afford to pay for study material like this. So by giving this a like, the video will pop up in front of more people, and then obviously you'll be helping more people that can't afford to pay for studies. And then of course, if you'd like to know when module 3 of this course goes live or any of my other content, then maybe consider subscribing yourself, who knows. Alright folks, let's go jump into that first main section. Alright folks, starting with the first section in this module, cables and connectors. Now the first topic we're going to dive into in this section guys is personal computers. Now at first glance you're probably wondering, what the heck does that have to do with cables and connectors inside a box? You'd remember I said in the beginning, the title of the module does not tell you everything that's going to be in a module. The same can be said about the titles of these sections. So when I say cables and connectors, yes, for the most part, that's what you're going to find in this section, but it's not going to be the only stuff you will find in this section. Now starting with personal computers guys, what is the system case? The system case guys, for those of you who don't know, is what you would put everything into, where you would find all the internal components, the organs, if you will, of your computer case. You get 2 kinds. You get an all-in-one and you get a tower case. Now in terms of an all-in-one, these are quite rare. There's a picture for you guys of what one might look like. At first glance, this will look like a screen. It'll look like a normal computer monitor, but if you look a little bit closer, you'll see a lot of these are actually a lot thicker. It looks like a very thick, oversized computer monitor. And that, guys, is because this whole screen is in fact your computer. It's not just a screen. It is a computer. That's why it's called an all-in-one. So your motherboard, the hard drive, the processor, absolutely everything of your machine is in that screen. It's called an all-in-one. Now these are generally more popular with office work. So if you want to do gaming and stuff, this is not ideal. You know, obviously it's not going to have proper cooling. It's not going to have room for proper expansion and all that. So this is generally more intended for your normal office work environment where you might not have a lot of room for a computer case, you know, that kinds of stuff. Now speaking of a computer case, this is what a tower case looks like guys. That's pretty much a normal tower case. You can see this one actually still has an optical drive there at the top. I mean, can you believe it? I mean, when's the last time you've seen a computer come out with an optical drive? If you go to any tech store nowadays and you try and buy yourself a laptop or a desktop, good luck finding one that comes with an optical drive. that would be an example of legacy hardware. Stuff that doesn't get made anymore, stuff that doesn't get used anymore. Now guys, this is a standard tower case. You can see it's got a start button in the front. Sometimes you might get lucky, you might get a restart button. There's your front panel ports. You've got USB normally. You'll have your audio jacks. You've got your mic in. You've got your earphones out there. You know, your audio jack out there. Now, usually it's common to find these in the front of the case, but you can sometimes actually find these on the top of the case. You know, it depends on the case. If you go look at these fancy gaming cases you find, a lot of them, these little ports would actually be on the top of the case. The power button will even sometimes be on the top of the case. So we call these the front panel ports and the front panel features. So those buttons, the start button, the restart button and stuff, that's your front panel features. And the ports, those USB ports, the mic and the audio and all that, that is your front panel ports, guys. Now just to show you guys that this can possibly be at the top of the case, there's another picture for you guys. So this one, it's kind of sort of at the top, not completely, but it's close enough. So there's really going to be cases where sometimes you'll find it on the top of the computer case, other times you'll find it in the front of the computer case. But if you've got yourself a gaming computer case, I can almost guarantee you it's going to be somewhere at the top of the computer case. Anyway, folks, let me get this picture out of the way. Let's talk about the side of a computer case, the side panel. So if you were to go and turn this computer case around, maybe you flip it on its side, and remove the side panel, what would we see? Here is a picture for you guys of more or less what you can expect to see when you were to go and remove the side panel of a computer case. Now, this is not the latest stuff. I mean, here at the bottom right, for instance, you can see those are hard drive bays. All these new, more modern computer cases don't actually have these hard drive bays anymore because those are the old mechanical hard drive bays. Nowadays, you'll find machines are using solid-state drives, or they will go and use what we call an M.2 slot on your motherboard. Those kinds of hard drives are much smaller and much faster. They actually fit onto the motherboard. Now, since these hard drives are so small and so fast, we don't actually have a need for these special bays anymore where we'll go and put these hard drives. There, the top right hand side, guys, there is where you would go and put your optical drives if you still have one. But nowadays, if you go buy yourself a new modern computer case, I can almost guarantee you, you will not find these bays for an optical drive. They're not going to be there. At the bottom left, guys, that is your PSU, which is short for Power Supply Unit. Now, if you've got yourself a gaming computer case, you're more than likely going to find this power supply unit at the bottom left. Or should I say the back bottom of your computer case. If you've got yourself a normal office computer case, these are most likely going to be at the top of the case. Top back, or in this picture, will be the top left-hand side of this case. So in reality, guys, it actually doesn't matter where you find this power supply. At the end of the day, if you go look at gaming cases, the only reason why they're at the bottom is because you can go and hide it at the bottom. It's out of sight. It makes the gaming case look neater. It makes it look cooler, cleaner, that kind of stuff. But in reality, it really does not matter where you have this power supply, guys, as long as the cables are long enough to reach the various components that they need to go and plug into. These components will be things like your motherboard, the graphics card. If you've got those old hard drives, maybe you go and plug into those. Maybe your case fans. So at the end of the day, as long as your cables are long enough to reach the various components, you can probably go and put this power supply wherever you want in this computer case. It's up to you. Now, if you look there, in that vicinity there, guys, that is the motherboard. This motherboard's got two massive graphics cards there plugged in, so it's kind of obstructing your view from the motherboard. And it's got a cooling system on top of the CPU, which looks like it's a massive air cooling system. You guys will learn more about this later in the course. You'll see better examples later in the course. So let me see if I can give you guys another picture example. I'm going to get this case out of the way. Here's another one for you guys. So this one, same concept. I mean, it's a white case now. It still has hard drive bays on the right. It's got the optical drive bays there on the top. It's got the power supply unit there at the bottom again. But this one, at least we can see the motherboard a little bit more clearer now. It's only got one graphics card instead of two like earlier. And here, it does not have a massive air cooling system. Instead, it's got a liquid cooling system. So there's no fan there. Normally on top of the CPU, you would go and put a heat sink. It's aluminium. It looks like aluminium fins. And aluminium normally absorbs heat very well from your CPU, which gets very hot. And to help it cool down even further, you've got a fan on top of that aluminium heatsink that blows air between the fins, cooling it down even further. Now, what generally works a little bit better than air cooling is liquid cooling. So in this scenario, this is a very old design. They've got a liquid cooling system there on top of the CPU. You can see the pipes going up to the top of the case, where you would find the radiator. Now guys, this is not really the topic right now. We'll talk more about this under cooling in A+, which is not in this module. It's in a later module. But if you do have a radiator, you ideally always want to put this in the top of the case. It's very important that you preferably try and put the radiator at the top of the case. We'll talk more about that under cooling once we get to the cooling section in this A+ course. But for now, just remember, always put it in the top of the case. Alright guys, and before we move on, let me just show you guys one more example for computer case. I mean, why not? So there's a better one, a more modern one. So if you look there on the right hand side, you will notice the hard drive bays I showed you guys earlier. Those are missing. You'll notice those optical drive bays. Those are missing. And you'll see at the bottom, that's not the power supply per se. That's more like a hidden chamber that you can go and hide the power supply in. But if you look there at the bottom left, you can kind of still see the power supply sticking out there, where you have to go and put in the power cord, of course. There they've got a nice cooling system, a liquid cooling system. And you'll find that most of these new modern liquid cooling systems have actually got some sort of screen on them. And you can go and display all kinds of various things on them. You can display the time, the CPU temperature, the CPU fan. You can even display videos on them, for crying out loud. It's flippin' insane, guys. You can see the pipes where the cooling system goes up towards the top of the case once again, and that is where the radiator is. These radiators, guys, work in almost the exact same principle as a car's engine. So if we go look at a car's engine, it obviously gets hot. So what can be used to mitigate against that? That will be your car's cooling system. So you've got water or antifreeze or some sort of coolant pumping through the engine. That liquid absorbs the heat from the engine. It gets pumped to the front of the engine into your, what? Your radiator. The radiator has got a bunch of fins. It's got air blowing from the front through these fins, cooling down the water. And then that cooled down water gets pumped back into the engine, and this cycle repeats itself. Now your computer, if you've got a liquid cooling system, guys, works in the same principle. So the CPU is effectively the engine here. It generates a lot of heat. The water absorbs the heat from the CPU, gets pumped to the radiator at the top. It's got a bunch of fins, this radiator. It's got a bunch of fans, this radiator. The fans blow air between these fins, cooling down the liquid, and it gets pumped back to the CPU, and the cycle repeats itself. Of course, we'll talk more about this under cooling, so I'm kind of jumping the gun here. But if you find this interesting, stay tuned for the cooling section of A+. Unfortunately, guys, that is not in this module. It's coming up later, but it isn't Core 1 because that falls under hardware. Right, so let me get this machine out of the way. Let's talk a bit about the rear panel ports and features, guys. So there's a picture of a totally random machine at the back. If you look at the top left-hand side there, guys, that is where your motherboard is located. And around these ports of the motherboard, we've got what we call a dust cover. I mean, it's got many names. Now, I'm not sure if you guys have ever noticed, but when people put a motherboard into an empty shell, an empty case, somehow magically these metal plates at the back always align perfectly with the port of the motherboard. Why is that? It's because that metal plate, guys, actually comes with the motherboard. So if you buy yourself a motherboard and you open the box of the motherboard, one of the items you'll find in that box is that plate at the back. It's got many names, but most commonly this is referred to as a dust panel or a dust cover. So if you've got an empty shell of a case, before you even insert the motherboard or install the motherboard, you're going to take that dust panel, and then from the inside of the case, you're going to press it towards the outside. You're going to hear it click into place, and you're going to feel it click into place. After you've got that dust panel in place, then you can go and install the motherboard, and of course the ports are going to align perfectly. Should you want to remove the motherboard one day, you simply just go and repeat the process, but in reverse. So you remove the motherboard first, and then on that panel from the outside now, you press inwards, and once again you're going to hear it click out of place, and you're going to feel it click out of place, and it's going to fall to the inside of the case, and voila, you can go and swap the motherboards. Here at the bottom there you can see there's your expansion cards, if you have any. These days you'll find that nobody's got any expansion cards. The only cards we've got is a graphics card. People these days don't install expansion cards anymore. Most motherboards don't even come out of PCI slots anymore. They only come out of PCIe expansion slots, which is the graphics card expansion slots. something you'll learn about a little bit more later, which is actually going to be in today's module, by the way. Here at the bottom, guys, that is the PSU, your power supply unit. Now, in this instance, it's at the bottom. But like I said earlier, this can actually be anywhere in the case. It can either be at the top, it could be at the bottom, it could be anywhere, as long as the cables are long enough to reach the various components inside the computer case. Here, you've got a fan. Now, by the looks of it, this looks like a 120mm fan. Usually, this one blows air out at the back of the case. With most computer cases, they will suck air in the front, and they will blow air out at the back. Now, some of these fancier, more modern gaming cases, you'll find they're actually open at the top as well of the case, and there you'll normally put your radiator, and the fans will blow upwards, and it's going to blow hot air out at the top as well. So hot air will go out the top, it'll go out the back, and cool air will be sucked in from the front of the case. Alright folks, let's talk about peripheral devices. What the heck is that? Now, for those of you that don't know, peripheral devices are the various random components one would go and plug into your computer. Stuff outside your computer, not stuff inside your computer. So with that being said, peripheral devices, guys, are external components connected to a computer. This can be anything. It can be a flash drive. It can be an external drive. It can be your mouse, your keyboard, your scanner, your printer, your webcam. Pretty much anything on the outside of your case that you're going to go and connect to your case. You know, it's probably going to be via USB these days. Anything like that counts as a peripheral device. Now, usually these devices, guys, are non-essential for its core function. Things that are essential will be things like your CPU, your hard drive, your RAM. These are essential components. The stuff you plug in from the outside, most likely into like a USB port, your mouse, your keyboard, that kinds of jazz, that is not essential component. Alright folks, and then these peripheral devices, they obviously expand a computer's capabilities. I mean, if you look at something like a printer and a scanner, it gives your computer the ability to go and print stuff now that might be on the machine. A scanner gives your computer the ability to go and scan documents into the machine. If you've got an external drive or a flash drive, it gives your computer additional storage capabilities, which is outside your machine, and it can possibly be transported to another machine. So they expand on your computer's capabilities, and they do other purposes as well. If you're looking for a couple of examples of peripheral devices, because you guys are probably looking for some examples, I did in fact give you guys quite a bunch. But let's start with input device examples. Input, guys, are devices that's going to input information into your laptop or desktop. These would be devices like a keyboard, your mouse, your scanner, microphone, webcam, that kinds of stuff. Hopefully you guys get the idea. In terms of output devices, which present people with an output, like your printer. A printer prints a document, so it's an output. Speakers, your computer's displays what's going on your machine. These are all examples of output devices, guys. Right, folks, let's move on swiftly to the next topic. Universal Serial Bus Cables, better known as USB cables for short. Now, guys, with this, you get many USB connector types. Many ones. Here's a picture for you guys on the right-hand side of the various kinds you guys need to be familiar with. Now, looking at the picture on the right-hand side, the main ones you need to know are the top right-hand side. These don't really get asked in the exam, but it's still good to know these for, you know, going into the field and all that. So looking at the one at the top left under USB 2. So looking at the one at the top left for USB 2, that is normal type A. When we say type A, we basically mean that is a normal USB cable. The only thing that's going to be different here is maybe the speed of the cable, but type A is normally referred to as the normal USB port cable. If you look at type B, they're under USB 2. That's the speed, by the way. USB 2 is old technology, very slow. I think the maximum speed this one can go up is about 480 megabits per second, if I'm not mistaken. So looking at the second one on the left there under USB 2. That is most commonly found behind devices like printers, guys. So if you are fortunate enough to have a printer that gets plugged in via cable, specifically USB cable, that's the cable you would find plugged in behind the printer. And then the other end of that very same cable will look like USB type A. That's the part you're going to be plugging into your machine. If you look at the third cable there on the USB 2, That cable can be anywhere these days. They're actually a lot less common nowadays. So the place you'll probably find those these days is maybe with like a car's dash cam. I think that's the most common device I've found them on these days. Obviously, it's not limited to those devices. If you have a very old digital camera, very old wireless earphones or headphones, all of those kinds of devices actually use this port. But one of the most common devices I've seen at this exact time, where we find ourselves in right now, that still use that port, is probably a car's dash cam. If you look there way on the right, that is, well, I suppose that's actually a very old cell phone charger. A lot of devices still use that. So if you've got yourself a Bluetooth device, like a Bluetooth boombox or speaker, they tend to want to use these cables to charge themselves. And if you want to just go and plug something into this device, maybe to transmit, music or whatever, they use that. We also use these for earphones and headphones, just like the previous one. We used to use these for cell phones to charge them and transmit stuff to our computers, but they are being phased out. So there's a lot of countries of laws now that's being enforced, which basically force all cell phone manufacturers to use the same cable for their devices, which is USB Type-C. That's the one at the bottom right there, guys. USB Type-C is becoming very common. Most phones these days, almost all phones these days, will go and use USB Type-C. Obviously, it's not just limited to phones. You'll find that a lot of these new, more modern cases these days on the motherboard, instead of having just your normal USB ports at the back on the motherboard, they'll in fact have USB Type-C ports at the back. And yes, you do get those in different speeds as well. It's not just your normal USB ports that come in different speeds. These Type-C USB ports also come in different speeds. So if you see a black USB Type A port, it's normally the old USB 2, the slow ones. If you see a blue USB port, it's usually USB 3. I mean, we don't necessarily know which one, but it's usually USB 3. If you see a red one, those are even faster. But sometimes you do need to have additional drivers installed for these to work. Looking at the second cable from the right there on the USB 3, the most common place you guys will probably see that is on an external drive. Of course, not limited to those devices, but if you have an external drive, the cable that plugs into the external drive, that's what that connector would look like. And the other end of the cable will obviously be normal USB Type A. If you look at the Type B one there on the USB 3, second from the left there, that's probably the least common one you guys are going to see. We do get those, but they're very uncommon. And then of course, the one there on the left is normal Type A. That's just going to be USB 3 speed. Alright folks, moving you on to the next topic. Display types. The different kinds of displays you get. Now this is actually a kind of sort of new topic in this version of A+. I wouldn't say it wasn't in the old one, but this is a new objective that they've added to this module. So in the past, this was not in this module. Now it is. So with regards to display types, first of all guys, you get LCD, probably one of the most common kinds of displays you'll get on most phone screens and laptops, that kind of stuff. So this is probably easily one of the most common types of display you get is LCD, which is short for liquid crystal display. Now the name should kind of tell you what you need to know. It makes use of liquid crystals to modulate light, which creates images. So if any of you guys happen to have science in school and you know how light shines through a prism or a crystal, then you would know, how LCD works. Then you get LED. Now this, guys, is a type of LCD monitor that uses LEDs for backlighting. Instead of crystals and a light shining through the crystals, this is LEDs in the background that is basically creating the backlighting. Then you also get OLED. Now, OLEDs, these bad boys use organic compounds that emit light when an electrical current passes through them. Then you get CRT. This is probably one of the oldest ones you'll see on this list. I think it actually is the oldest one on this list. We don't get CRT anymore, by the way. So this one, guys, uses electron beams to illuminate phosphorus on the screen, which creates images. I think the last time I saw CRT, if I'm being honest, was around 2009. Now, I stand to be corrected. I don't know if this is the case in all countries, but in my specific country, they got discontinued in the year 2009. And then obviously we still saw them around, for another 2 or 3 years or so. But they gradually started being phased out. So I'm assuming it was kind of sort of more or less the same period for other countries as well. So probably around the period of 2009 is when you would have last really seen them, and then up until about maybe 2011, 2012, and then they would have kind of just disappeared from the market. You know, so very rarely will you still see those big CRT screens. It looks like a giant big box you've got to go and carry. Man, thank goodness we don't have those anymore. Then the last one, guys, that I've got for you is plasma. Also relatively old, actually. So plasma, this one uses ionized gas. I kid you not. Ionized gas, which they refer to as plasma, to emit light and create the images that you actually see on the screen. Right, and then, still kind of on the topic of display, kind of, you know, being the keywords here. So, HDMI and DisplayPort video cables, guys. So, these are the only two video cables you get that transmit both video and audio at the same time. So, if we can look at the other ones, which we are still going to discuss in this course, you know, cables like VGA, DVI, very old S-video, all of those ones, they for the most part only transmit video. Now this, guys, is in fact a question in exam. I can guarantee you will get questions about this in the exam. Now normally how they'll refer to this, you know, it's probably going to be a monkey puzzle question. That's normally how they refer to this, is they'll say which of the following cables is able to transmit both video and audio, or is able to carry both video and audio at the same time. And in the exam, they're going to list 4 possible answers, of which you can only choose one. And the one you're going to be looking for is either HDMI or DisplayPort. Now, since they're both correct, they're not going to list both of them in the exam. They'll list either the one or the other. So you just go and check which one you see. If you see HDMI, that's the one you choose. If you see DisplayPort, that's the one you choose. So just go and check which one of these 2 answers you see there. That's going to be your answer, folks. Now, in terms of HDMI, which is high definition multimedia interface. There's a picture of what it looks like. So the one on the left is the standard HDMI cable. You guys probably would have seen this behind your TV screen, possibly behind your computer monitor if you've got a fancy computer monitor, maybe on your gaming graphics card if you've got a gaming graphics card. Some of the newer laptops have got this port. So that is able to obviously carry both sound and video at the same time. Now, unfortunately, HDMI's got royalties and things associated to that. So, yeah, royalties is always a bit of a bugger up. So, unfortunately, if people want to go and use this technology, they've got to go and pay royalties. So, yeah, a lot of manufacturers were like, we don't want to go and pay for royalties. So, somebody, somewhere along the line said, hey, boys, what about if we come up with our own? And that's where DisplayPort joined the party. There's a picture for you guys way on the right of what DisplayPort looks like. So at first glance it might look the same, but if you look very closely, you'll see the fitting, the little hole that it plugs into, is ever so slightly different. It is unique to that cable. Now this one doesn't have any royalties, you know, associated to it. I suppose you can call this open source if you want to. It's available for free to the general public. No royalties has to be paid. And it's able to achieve the exact same as HDMI. Now if both HDMI and DisplayPort, what I'm about to mention is not part of the course, and it will not be in the exam. With both of them, you do get different qualities, guys. Different speeds and different qualities. It's not a matter of all HDMI cables are the same, and it's not a matter of all DisplayPort cables are the same. Some of them are different speeds, different qualities, and all that. So, in some cases, you'll find your graphics card on your PC might support both HDMI and DisplayPort. And if your screen also supports both HDMI and DisplayPort, you might want to go and check on your graphics card which one is the better quality one on your specific graphics card. And then you just go get your a cable for that specific port, and then you're going to get better, you know, quality video on your screen and all that. It's not a must, but, you know, if you're a serious gamer and stuff, then you'll probably want to go and do that kind of stuff. And before we move on to the next topic, guys, just once again there on the HDMI, if you look at the one there on the right, that's the micro one or the mini one. Unfortunately, it's not really up to scale in this picture, so it's much, much smaller than that one. You know, some of the newer gamer motherboards might have that. Or some of the newer gamer graphics cards, but generally it's not that common. It's more common to see the one on the left, which is the standard HDMI size port. Alright, and then moving on to a different kind of cable, Thunderbolt and Lightning cables. So starting off with Thunderbolt, guys. Now this one is, well, kind of looks like USB-C. Thunderbolt can be used as a display interface like DisplayPort, which we just discussed, or HDMI actually, and as a general peripheral interface like USB. So you can use this as a DisplayPort or HDMI, or you can go use this as a general peripheral interface like USB. I mean, who would have thought, right? But for those of you who don't know, Thunderbolt versions 1 and 2, they use the same physical interface as a mini DisplayPort and are compatible with DisplayPort so that a monitor with a DisplayPort can be connected to a computer via a Thunderbolt port and a suitable adapter cable. Now, something you might also not know is Thunderbolt ports are distinguished from mini DisplayPort by a lightning bolt or a flash icon like the one you guys see there on the cable. Version 2 of the standard supports links of up to 20 gigabits per second. Now folks, like DisplayPort, multiple monitors can be connected to a single port by doing something called daisy chaining. So in other words, you're actually able to go and use one port on your computer, but you'll be able to go and link, 2 screens, 3 screens, all to one port. Very convenient if you are someone with lots of screens, but you find yourself in a pickle where you might only have, one port, unfortunately. It happens to the best of us, what can we say? Guys, Thunderbolt version 3, this one changes the physical interface to use the same port connector and cabling as USB-C. Now, converter cables are available to connect Thunderbolt 1 or 2 devices to Thunderbolt 3 ports. So there's always going to be some sort of adapter or a connector you guys can go make use of. A USB device plugged into a Thunderbolt 3 port will function normally, but Thunderbolt devices will not work if connected to a USB port that is not Thunderbolt enabled. So if you want to go and connect the Thunderbolt device to a USB port and that port is not Thunderbolt enabled, yeah, no luck. It's not going to work. Lastly, folks, Thunderbolt 3 supports up to 40 gigabits per second over a short, high-quality cable, which is normally up to about half a meter. So that's approximately, 1.6 feet if we use the non-metric system. I'm more familiar with the metric system, which is about half a meter, 0.5 meters. But if you're using the non-metric system, that's equivalent to about 1.6 feet if you go and use a converter. And then the other cable, folks, lightning cable. Now, if you are a Windows user, such as myself, then you probably have never seen this cable. You probably don't know what this cable is. This cable is normally proprietary to, Apple and iPhone and that kind of stuff. I can't even say that word, without butchering it. So Apple's iPhone and Apple's iPad mobile devices use this lightning cable or lightning port connector, and the lightning cable is, of course, reversible. Now, the lightning port is found only on Apple's mobile devices, guys, just in case you didn't know, so watch out. Might be a question exam. Now, to connect such a device to a PC, you need a suitable adapter cable, such as Lightning to USB-A or Lightning to USB-C. If you don't have one of those, it ain't gonna work. Okay, folks, I'm going to move you on to the last topic for this specific section. That would be SATA hard drive cables. Now, for those of you that don't know, SATA, or SATA as some people pronounce it, it is Serial Advanced Technology Attachment. That's what it stands for. I doubt they will ask you that in the exam. I haven't seen them ask that in the exam, but there you go, just in case. So when it comes to these hard drives, folks, they connect with 2 cables. One would be your data cable. The other would be the power cable. Now, in terms of the data cable, there's a picture of you guys there on the right-hand side of what that would more or less look like. Now, guys, that one is a bit red in color, but the color in reality does not matter. The most common colors you'll find for these cables are normally red and yellow, sometimes pink. But you can actually find them in pretty much any color rainbow. I've got black ones, I've seen blue ones, I've seen green ones. They can actually be any color of the rainbow. Most commonly, however, they will be red or yellow. But the color does not matter of these cables. Now, the good news about these cables is when it comes to the hard drive, or even optical drive, because we used to use these on the old optical drives, not something you guys need to worry about since nobody has optical drives anymore. But on a hard drive, it can only go in on one port and it can only go in one way. On your motherboard, should your motherboard have SATA ports, which they normally do, they normally have at least 4 of these ports. Should it have one, they can only go in that one port and that one port alone. So it's not something you guys have to worry about. It can only fit in one way. If you look very closely in that fitting there, you'll see it looks almost like a little L shape. And the hole or the socket that it needs to go into on the motherboard and the device looks exactly the same. It's got like a little L shape, thing sticking out of it. So this red cable, guys, is the data cable, the one that transmits the data between the hard drive and your motherboard and everything else. Then you get the power connector. So there is a picture for you guys of what the power connector looks like. That part of the cable, guys, goes and connects to your hard drive. So there's only two cables that plugs into the hard drive. One is the data one, that one that's red at the top. The other one is the power cable to provide power to this device. The power cable, the other end of the cable, that is going to be coming from your power supply unit. PSU for short. So from the power supply, the power cable plugs into the hard drive, and then the second cable plugs into the hard drive, which is your data cable, and the other end of that cable plugs into the motherboard. Pretty straightforward. And a little extra, I don't really know why this isn't a course, but I'm adding it for you guys as an extra because it's part of the course. Molex connector. So there is a picture for you guys on the left hand side of what a Molex connector looks like. That is a power connector as well. It also comes from the power supply, obvious, but this is for all the devices in your computer. So if you have a very old hard drive, a PATA, not a SATA, a PATA hard drive, which we also refer to as an IDE hard drive, if you have one of those, that would have been the power cable. We don't really see those anymore. They're basically legacy, kind of extinct at this point in time. The very old optical drives also used to use those. And in some cases, well, literally in some cases, you would actually find the case fans also using that. It's not recommended to go and connect a case fan to one of those because the fan would always be running at a fixed speed and it will always be running at maximum speed, which is not always what we want. Sometimes the machine might just be idling and now the fans are running at maximum speed the whole time, which is not ideal. You'll find that a lot of fans these days, the new, more modern fans, they've got additional cables that you can go and plug into the motherboard. And that allows your motherboard to go and control the speed of the fans. So the more heavy lifting your computer does, the harder it works. Well, obviously then the hotter it's going to get, and then the faster the fans will start spinning automatically. So that's your computer doing that. But if you're going to just plug it into one of those Molex connectors, I mean, it's not the worst thing it could happen. But your fans are always going to be running at maximum speed, and let's face it, some of these fans are quite noisy. Alright folks, so that finally brings us to the end of the first section in this module. Moving you guys into the second main section of this module, which is motherboards. Now the first topic up in this module, guys, is electrical safety and ESD. Now, if you don't know what ESD stands for, it's electrostatic discharge. Now before we can talk about motherboards, it's very important that you know what this is and how to go and avoid it. So for those of you that don't know, the human body has enough static electricity in it to blow circuit boards like the motherboard, like your RAM chips, like your graphics card, and things like that. So what we want to do is we want to discharge safely so that we don't blow these circuit boards of ours. Now the good news here is in real life, these boards have actually become so robust, they're not as sensitive as they used to be about 10 or 15 years ago. So chances are, if you go and pick up a motherboard these days, you're very unlikely to go and blow it. But we still need to cover this topic, we still need to explain it, and we still need to understand it because it's definitely something they will ask you about in the exam. Normally the average person would get at least one question about this in the exam, sometimes up to 3 questions about this in the exam. But you can expect at least one question about this exam. So it's important you understand what this is, but more important, how you can avoid it. So in the exam, they normally test if you know what can be done to avoid this from happening and, you know, from the customer or the user or yourself from blowing a circuit board. So first things first, guys, when it comes to electrical safety, just in general, always disconnect the power. So if you are about to go and work on a desktop computer, for instance, go and turn off the power behind the power supply. There's normally a little button behind the power supply. I'll show you guys later what that button looks like. Once you've turned the power off, you know, behind the power supply, make sure it's turned off by the wall socket. Unplug it from the wall socket. And if you really want to be paranoid, you can also go and unplug it from your power supply. So completely turn the power off. Completely disconnect the power. Never assume that these buttons are working. There's always a first time for everything. One day is one day, and you or that person is going to go and turn the power off just by the wall or just the power supply, and then you might find that that button is faulty. Now, I've never ever seen that happen, yet being the key word here, but there's always a first time. So safety should always be your number one concern, guys. And I can tell you now, they will test you on that in the exam. So as long as you always put safety first, you'll always get the question right in the exam. Now getting back to the actual topic here, ESD, electrostatic discharge, guys. Now what can we go and use to help avoid this? So tools-wise, you'll find that the tools you go and use to go and build a PC, to go and install the motherboard or do whatever in a PC, these tools, guys, at first glance, they might look like normal tools, but they're not. These tools are anti-static. If you go and get yourself a little toolkit that comes with the screwdrivers and everything you need to go and build PCs, these screwdrivers you'll find are not magnetic. They're not static. You can go and use them. They're specialized. They're specifically made for computers. If you're going to go and use a normal screwdriver from a normal toolbox, often you'll find that these screwdrivers have got magnetic tips. And these screwdrivers are not anti-static. So you actually stand a very good chance of blowing your motherboard by using a normal standard screwdriver. And yeah, we just don't recommend that. What you'll also notice is when you buy electrical components for a computer, the motherboard, the hard drive, the graphics card, all of these boards and stuff, you'll find that they come in a special bag. At first glance, it might look like a normal bag to you guys, but it's not. That, folks, is an anti-static bag. So if this item that you're buying is in a static environment, it's not gonna do anything because that's an anti-static bag. You'll feel it's actually a very thick bag. It feels like a hard kind of weird plastic. To a certain degree, some of them are actually a little transparent, but it's an anti-static bag. So if you have one of these bags, and let's say you just bought an item, I would not throw these bags away. You're always going to need them again later. So if you've got an old second-hand item that you just took out of a computer case, it's always a good idea to not just put it randomly somewhere. Put it in one of these old bags of yours. At least you can prevent this item from blowing, because of some static, in that environment. Now, what they will especially test you on the exam is if you can go and use what we call an anti-static wrist strap or a rubber mat. Now, the course itself, we for the most part just mentioned the wrist strap, but strangely enough in the exam, they sometimes test you on stuff which is not mentioned in the official courses. The official courses don't really mention the rubber mat, but in the exam, there's two possible answers. It can either be an anti-static wrist strap. There's a picture for you guys of what that might look like. So you can go and put this little thing around your wrists or your ankle. We call it a wrist strap, but the fact of the matter is it doesn't really matter where on your body you put it. You can put it around your ankle, you can put it around your wrist, and then you can see it's got a little alligator clip there. You're supposed to go and clip that onto something that's grounded, preferably something metal. So if you're working on a computer case, ideally you're going to go and clip it onto the frame of the computer case. Not the outside, preferably, guys, the inside of the frame. The outside might feel like metal, it might sound like metal, but in some cases the outside is not really conductive. It's a weird kind of metal. So the inside of the frame is normally a conductive metal. So always clip this on the inside of the frame, never the outside of the frame. That's not something that will test you on an exam. That's just me giving you guys extra tips. Life lessons, so you guys don't go and blow something. So always clip it onto something metal, preferably the inside of the frame. If you're going to go and clip this onto a table, which you can, by the way, it doesn't really help to go and clip this onto a wooden table. It has to be a metal table, which is on the ground. So this table obviously has to be making contact with the ground. Otherwise, it's not really going to work because you're not grounded, guys. Alright, and then before I continue to the next topic, guys, what you can also go and use is a rubber mat. Now, the proper way to go and do this, not that anybody actually does this, is underneath your feet, there's supposed to be a special rubber mat. And then on the desk where you're going to be working on these computers, on the desk there's supposed to be a rubber mat as well. And then you put the PC on that rubber mat while you're standing on the second rubber mat. Now, according to CompTIA, that's what you're supposed to go and do. You're supposed to stand on a rubber mat, you're supposed to put the PC on the rubber mat, and you're supposed to go and ground yourself using what we call an anti-static wrist strap. In real life, guys, most people don't do that. I can tell you now, more than 90% of people don't do that. So there's a difference between what you learn in books and in the courses versus what you're actually going to be doing in reality. Unfortunately, this is part of the course, and unfortunately, I can guarantee you they will ask you this in the exam, even though nobody actually does this. So please remember this for your exam. Once you guys pass the exam, then it's not as crucial to remember this. In real life, what most of us will go and do is, if you're busy building a PC, instead of having a rubber mat or an anti-static wrist strap, you'll probably just go and touch the frame. So you can literally just use your hand, touch the inside of the computer frame, and then you can go and work with the components inside. You would have just safely discharged yourself into the frame of the computer case. But if you were to walk away a few steps to go and pick up a screwdriver or something perhaps, and you walk back, you'll have to do this again. In the beginning, I'm not going to lie to you, it's going to require a lot of concentration to remember to do this. But eventually, you're going to get used to this so quickly. It's going to become muscle memory. You're going to do it without even noticing it, guys. This is like putting on your safety belt in a car. In the beginning, your parents might tell you, put on your safety belt. And it's going to require concentration from your side to remember to do this. You know, they might have to remind you a couple of times. But now you're probably at a point in time in your life where you might do this instinctively without even thinking about it. If I ask you afterwards, did you wear your safety belt? You might be like, I think so. Meanwhile, you did. You did it instinctively without even thinking about it. That's called muscle memory. So you're going to get to a point very quickly, you wouldn't believe how quickly this happens, where you're going to go and do this automatically because of muscle memory. Alright folks, let's move on to motherboard connector types. Alright, so folks, the base set of connectors for CPU, memory, disk drive and peripherals, where is that? There's a picture for you guys there on the right hand side. It's not the best picture, so what I'll do is I'll show you guys practically on a video in a few moments what this will actually look like on an old motherboard that I've got lying around. It's strangely enough a working PC that I'm going to be showing you guys this on, but it's a very old PC. But the concept still applies. I mean, at the end of the day, 1 plus 1 is always going to be 2. So using this picture for the moment, you can see there is the CPU socket. So we call that the CPU because it used to be in a central. So central processing unit, because from top to bottom, as well as left to right, it used to be in a center. It wasn't always a chip. It actually used to be a slot for a card in the middle. That used to be your CPU. Back then, CPUs were not as fast as they are nowadays. And then eventually, as time went by, these things got faster and faster. So there was obviously a need to go and change the technology. A card for a CPU was no longer suitable. So we had to go and change this to a CPU socket on the motherboard. So that's how we ended up with that socket now there at the top. So from left to right, it's still more or less in the middle. From top to bottom, not so much. If you look there way on the right hand side, these are your memory slots, guys. Also known as your system memory, also known as your RAM or random access memory. Now this picture we've got in front of us, there we've got 4 RAM slots. Some motherboards might only have 2 RAM slots. So on average you'll see between 2 or 4 RAM slots. If you go look at something like a server motherboard, they could have up to 16 or even more RAM slots. Not something you guys need to worry about at A+ level. A+ for the most part only covers laptops and desktops. What you guys will also notice, I might as well mention this now, but we are going to cover this later. If you look at those RAM slots, I know it's not the clearest picture, you'll notice that out of those 4 RAM slots, there's 2 different colors. The one closest to the CPU is a dark color. It's like a dark gray. The second closest one to the CPU is like a light gray. And then the third one is the same as the first one. It's like a dark gray. And then the fourth one is the same as the second one. This is because of channels, guys. Ideally, you want to put RAM on the same channel. So as an example, if I put a RAM chip in that first slot, the dark gray one on the left, if I'm lucky enough to have a second RAM chip, I'm not going to put it in the second slot. I'm in fact going to put it in the third slot because that's the same channel. You're going to fill up a channel first. It works better that way because of the bandwidth and all that. In the past, it was sometimes better to start the slot closest to the CPU because of the distance. To us, it doesn't really look like a big difference there, but for computers, that's light years apart. Nowadays, you'll find a lot of the new modern gaming motherboards and stuff, instead of starting you at slot 1 and then slot 3, they'll start you at slot 2 and slot 4. So if you're lucky enough to have 2 RAM chips, you'll put your first RAM chip into slot 2, that will be the light gray one closest to the CPU, and your second RAM chip into slot 4. Now normally your motherboard will indicate which one you have to go and use. Never mind having to go look at the manual, right next to those RAM slots on the motherboard, I know you guys can't see this picture, but literally on the motherboard, these slots will be very clearly labeled and it will tell you, fill slot 2 and slot 4 first. It actually says so physically on the motherboard with a little picture there. So even if you've never done this before in your life, if you look at the motherboard right before you're about to put the RAM chips in, you'll see, oh, hang on guys, here it shows me I need to use slot 2 and slot 4 first. It actually shows you on the motherboard, I kid you not. Something they did not do in the past on very old motherboards. If you look there on the left hand side, guys, we call that your I/O. So that's your input and output, ports. So input will be things like a mouse, a keyboard. Output will obviously be something like a screen, a printer, that kind of stuff. So that's all your input and output ports. If you look way on the right there, that is your SATA ports. Those ones are facing sideways. Now, some of the older motherboards, the old low-quality motherboards, the ports will be facing upwards towards us when you're facing the motherboard. Now, because of the graphics card slot being often aligned to the SATA ports, somebody said, you know what if we have these SATA ports facing sideways? Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get a cable in there. Now, as for the graphics card, there is the slot. A lot of motherboards these days you'll find might have more than one graphics card slot. They might have 2, they might have 3. but at the very least they normally have one slot. We call that your PCIe slot. So that one is right there. That's going to be the top slot there, guys. And if you check there, you'll see it's aligned with the SATA ports. So if I happen to have a graphics card, which often extends well beyond the edge of this motherboard, and I happen to have SATA cables I want to plug in for SATA hard drives, that's going to be an issue if those SATA ports were facing upwards, because the graphics card would have been in the way. You're going to have to sacrifice the SATA device or the graphics card. So some designer said, you know what, no, the heck of that, boys. What if we have these SATA ports facing sideways instead of upwards? Then we can kind of wiggle in the SATA cables underneath there and still have the graphics card. We don't have to sacrifice either or of these two. If you look below the graphics card slot there, guys, you'll see there's a couple other slots there as well. As I said, some of them might be additional graphics card slots. I can't see clearly in this picture. Some of them might just be what we call normal PCI slots, times 4. That's basically the speed of the slot. So these normal PCI slots, which are very uncommon nowadays, are for other expansion things. Things like a sound card, a TV card, an old modem. Nobody uses any of those old expansion cards. So nowadays, the only card somebody would go and put in there is obviously going to be a graphics card for the most part, folks. So what I'm going to do for you guys in this module, just a little bit later in the video, is I'm going to show you guys a video within this video of where I've got an ATX motherboard, a normal standard ATX form factor motherboard. Kind of an old one, but just where I show you guys physically on a real motherboard where you find each of these components. So I'm going to first, for now, continue with these little animations. And then once we've covered all the topics, we'll show you guys practically on the real motherboard where you would find these things and what it actually looks like on a real motherboard. So before we get to that, let's first move on to the next topic. CPU socket and motherboard heatsinks. So first of all, guys, with regards to the socket type for the CPU, this depends on the manufacturer. So normally when most of us want to build a PC, the first thing you need to decide is what brand of CPU do you want? Do you want Intel or do you want AMD? These two are the two alpha dogs when it comes to CPUs. You're going to have to go and decide which one you want, which one you're a fan of, or what your unique needs are. So if you want to do workloads, you might choose the one. If you want to play gaming, you might choose the other one. And even if you go and decide, hey, I would like to get myself an Intel, or hey, I would like to get myself an AMD, it's not a matter of let me just go and get myself a CPU. That's normally what we start with. You decide on the brand of the CPU, and then you decide on the make and the model of the CPU based on your spec requirements and based on your budget. Once you decide on the CPU, then you check what motherboard supports that CPU of yours. So if I'm looking at an Intel CPU, and the CPU is an 1155, that means it's got 1155 contact points, pins. So on the motherboard, if you go check, the motherboard will have 1,155 little pins, very small little pins, that's going to make contact with that CPU. Underneath the CPU, that Intel CPU, if you were to lift it up, you'll see little contact points, 1,155. So whatever socket of CPU you get, you need to make sure you get the same socket motherboard, guys. Otherwise, you're going to have a mismatch, and it's not going to fit, and it's not going to make proper contact. AMD works slightly different. So if AMD, if you've got yourself an AMD Ryzen CPU, normally most of them are going to be Ryzen, you need to make sure you've got the right motherboard. So it's probably going to be something along the lines of an AM4 motherboard or an AM5 motherboard. AM4 is the older generation, guys. So if you have a gaming PC, which is probably going to be why you've got an AMD PC, you'll most likely have an AM4 motherboard if you built your PC, let's say, 3 or 5 years ago. Then you probably have an AM4 motherboard of one of the older generation CPUs. If you built your PC recently, especially if it's a high-spec machine, you more than likely have an AM5 motherboard with the newer generation of CPU chips. So it's all about how new your motherboard is. The newer motherboards, which are AM5 on the AMD side, they support the newer CPUs. Unfortunately, if you've got an older motherboard, which is 3 or 5 years old or older, it will not necessarily support the newer CPUs. You'll tend to want to have to go and change the motherboard to support that new CPU. And if you change the motherboard, you'll more than likely have to change the RAM as well. Most of the old AM4 motherboards support DDR4 RAM, if you know what that is. So RAM-wise, it supports DDR4, most of them. And then the newer AM5 motherboards, they for the most part support DDR5 RAM. So you're probably going to end up changing your RAM as well, if you guys know what that is. More on that later. Now as for the CPU socket, as you guys can see there on the picture, it's the same picture we had earlier, it's just a little bit more zoomed in. It's that square little socket. So whether this be Intel, whether it be AMD, potato, it's always going to be in the same location. It's usually a square little socket near the memory banks. When they say memory banks, they mean those RAM slots you see there on the right hand side. Now, when you do eventually decide to go and put a CPU in, whether it be Intel or AMD, you're going to have to cool that sucker down, guys. If it's a low level or low spec machine, it's probably going to be an air cooler. So on top of that CPU, you're going to put a heat sink. It's going to be a piece of metal, which is generally made out of aluminium, because aluminium absorbs heat very well. It's going to be in the shape and form of fins. And the reason for that is because you're going to have a fan connected to that heatsink that blows air through the heatsink, cooling it down even further. So aluminium is a very good conductor of heat. It stays cool very well, but to aid with that even further, you've got a fan blowing between the heatsink fins to cool it down even further. Now, if you have a lot of money, and if you've got a high-spec gaming machine, you tend to want to have got yourself a liquid cooling system, kind of like what we saw in the beginning of this video. Instead of having an aluminium heatsink on top of the CPU with a fan, you'll have some sort of water block on top of that CPU, and that is going to absorb the heat, and it's going to pump that to a radiator elsewhere. And through that radiator, you can have a bunch of fans blowing through a bunch of fins. Kind of the same concept, except it's just going to be water. So at the end of the day, as long as you cool down the CPU, that is the most important thing here, folks. If you're wondering what this heatsink and fan looks like, don't stress. That is going to be in the videos later on as well. So just stay tuned for that. For now, let's first get you guys to the memory side of things. So in terms of memory slots, guys, that is your random access memory, or should I say system memory. We usually refer to this as random access memory, RAM for short. Now, folks, this is the principal storage space for computer data and program instructions. It's an example of volatile memory. If you don't know what that means, volatile memory loses data when power is lost. If you still don't know what I mean by that, so let's cover volatile memory here. Anything you've got open on your machine, guys, like you tend to want to have a web browser open on your device right now, whether it be your phone or your laptop or your desktop, you've got a web browser open most likely, and on that web browser, you're probably watching YouTube. Now that browser, guys, is loaded into your RAM. Anything you've got open on your device, let's say your laptop or desktop, whether it be a program, a game, a document or a file, anything you've got open gets loaded into your RAM temporarily. Think of that as your working space. The RAM is one of the fastest types of memory you get in your computer. Your hard drive, or at least the old hard drives were not that fast. Usually the older hard drives was the slowest component in any computer. The hard drive, guys, is your long-term permanent storage. So anything you've installed, all your documents and files are stored there. And when you turn your PC off, it's not lost. The next time you turn your machine back on, you'll have to go double-click on that file or document, or double-click on the icon of that program or game, and it's going to load it from your slow long-term memory, being the hard drive, into your faster memory, being your RAM. So the RAM is much faster than your hard drive, but it's unfortunately volatile. So it's much, much faster, but it's temporary. So if you were to turn your PC off, anything that was in the RAM is now lost. Now, if I have to give you a better example, imagine you've got a bunch of stuff open on your PC, documents and files and programs and stuff. And if you have a desktop PC and you yank out the power cord, would you agree with me that everything you had open will be closed now? It's closed because it was in your RAM and it's now lost. If you start that PC back up again by plugging the power cable in and you hit the power button, the files are not gone. They're not missing. They're just not open anymore. But if you go and double click on those documents again, or you open that program again, it's going to load it from the hard drive back into the RAM again. So the files are not lost per se, they're just closed. They were temporarily in your RAM while you've got them open and while you're using them. But as soon as power is lost, anything in the RAM that was open is lost. So if they ask you in the exam, give an example of volatile memory, because that's a question you might get in the exam. The example would be RAM. RAM, folks, is an example of volatile memory. If you look at something like a computer's hard drive, that's an example of non-volatile memory, because if power is lost, whatever is on a hard drive is not lost. That is long-term cold storage, guys. It's slow. Well, at least if we look at the old PATA drives and the old SATA drives, they're generally slow. If you look at the new .M2 slots that they've got on motherboards, for those of you who know what that is, that's not so slow. Those are actually quite fast these days. Now, these RAM chips, folks, they're normally packaged as DIMMs, double-sided memory. So you're usually going to have to try and use, to the best of your ability, 2 RAM chips. You'll find on both sides of the RAM chip has got memory. And if you can, do your best to try and get 2 RAM chips, not just 1. 1 is not too good. And if you've got more than 2, that's also not good. So just because you've got 4 RAM chip slots, guys, does not mean you should try and fill all 4 slots. The sweet spot is normally 2 RAM chips. 1, yeah, it'll give you a lot of RAM. It'll give you decent speed. But you're not going to have the optimal bandwidth. 2 RAM chips is better. So instead of having just 1 RAM chip of 8 gigs, you'll be better off having 2 RAM chips of 4 gig each, respectively, because of the bandwidth. Now, yes, you can go and add a 3rd or a 4th, but then you're going to go and, cause instability in your system. It's going to get slower again. So the sweet spot is, in the end of the day, going to always be 2 RAM chips for most machines. Very rarely will you get, proper stability out of 4 RAM chips. So if you just need a lot of RAM, then I suppose you can go and do that. But if you are a serious gamer or someone that needs serious speed and stuff like that, then you're going to want to try and keep the 2 RAM chips, guys. You'll see any proper gamer with installed will always have only 2 RAM chips in, not more than 2. More than 2 causes instability in a system. Alright, then I'm going to move you on to the bottom left of the motherboard, guys. On the bottom left of most motherboards, you will find the CMOS and RTC batteries. Now, to help aid with this, now if you guys don't know what the CMOS battery is, that battery, guys, powers the chipset that keeps track of the date and time for the system. It's also referred to, as I said, the RTC battery or clock battery. There's a bit of a picture for you guys. In this picture, you can see it looks like a coin cell battery. You'll actually find that exact same size battery in your car's remote, depending on the car you drive. And in this picture, it's at the bottom left of the motherboard. That's actually a very common place to find it, somewhere in the vicinity of the bottom left of the motherboard. But they can also potentially be located at the bottom right of the motherboard, depending on the brand and the model of your motherboard. These batteries, folks, on average last approximately about 5 to 10 years. So if you buy yourself a motherboard, chances are it's probably going to last you 10 years, if not longer. The motherboard will break or fail long before the battery fails, but there are a couple of duds out there. I have come across quite a few clients where the battery would fail literally within a year or 2 after this motherboard was bought. And I suppose this could be a matter of maybe it was old stock in the factory, maybe it's a dud, maybe something else happened. But on average, the batteries will long exceed the lifespan of the motherboard. Now, due to that, you'll probably end up having a lot of old failed motherboards or broken motherboards lying in a box somewhere, all of which where the batteries are still perfectly fine. And eventually one day, if you happen to come across a client or a user where the battery seems to be the problem, instead of having to go and buy a new battery, they're not expensive, they're actually very inexpensive, but instead of having to go through the inconvenience of having to go and buy a battery, you could literally just go to that box of yours, which has got all these old motherboards, and just go and snatch one of those old batteries and swap them. And you're going to find it's going to work just fine. So what does it do? It helps keep track of the system date and time. If you've ever plugged out a desktop PC, and let's say you kept it plugged out for a while, a couple of days or weeks, and you plugged it back in, you probably would have noticed by now that the date and the time is always correct for some strange reason. How is it that your machine always remembers the date and the time, even though it was plugged out? That, guys, is because of this coin cell CMOS battery. It helps the BIOS remember various things like the system date and time. It helps it remember all kinds of other settings like your BIOS password if you have one, your system boot order, so if you want to boot from your hard drive first instead of a CD-ROM, or instead of a flash drive, or instead of the network, it's going to help the system remember those settings. Any BIOS related settings, whether it be overclocking, whatever, the CMOS battery helps the computer remember that. So if you've got some sort of configuration settings or whatever in your BIOS and you're not sure how to go and reset them, including the password I might add, removing the coin cell battery will force the BIOS to forget that. So normally I would recommend you remove it for about 5 minutes. It doesn't always forget immediately. So if you have a BIOS password and you want to bypass that, maybe it's for legitimate reasons, one way would be to go and remove the battery, wait about 5 to 10 minutes, put it back in, and the next time you start that PC, you're going to see it's not going to know what the date is, it's going to have no clue what the time is, it's not going to have a clue what the boot order is. You will have to go and reconfigure all of this stuff from scratch again. But it's quite a nice, easy way to go and reset everything back to defaults if you make a boo-boo along the line. Alright, folks, and then in terms of expansion slots, what is that? I did very briefly show you guys earlier in one of those animation pictures. I showed you guys the PCIe and the PCI slot. So I will show you guys this again later in that other video I was talking about, so just stay tuned for that. But for the time being, until we get there, an expansion slot, guys. This is connection slots on the motherboard in which adapter cards, like your graphics card, can be installed to extend the range of functions the computer can perform. Now, most of us, including myself, will probably only use this to go and add something like a graphics card. Let's face it, that's the only thing that most of us are going to be using these expansion cards for, is to go and add a fancy graphics card because maybe you want to go and play games, or maybe you need this graphics card to go and do something like rendering. I actually use a fancy graphics card to do the rendering for these videos. It's in your interest to have a graphics card. If you don't have a proper graphics card, rendering these videos that we make on YouTube is actually a bit of a mission. I'm not saying it's impossible, but trust me, it's a mission. Especially if you have a video that's as long as these ones. Normal onboard graphics cards really are not good at rendering long form videos like this one. You need a proper graphics card, otherwise your system is just going to crash on you. Other expansion cards could be, of course, a TV card, a Wi-Fi card, a modem. Not that we're going to be using any of those. I think realistically, the only one that you guys might use is a wireless card to give your desktop PC wireless capability like a laptop. Now, the new, latest motherboards for gaming PCs and stuff, they actually come with built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, believe it or not. But if you have a relatively old motherboard, or one that's not such a high-spec motherboard, then maybe you want Wi-Fi. If you want Wi-Fi, you can just go and add a cheap expansion card into one of those PCI slots, and voila! Now, I'll elaborate on that a little bit later. Once I show you guys that video, I'll show you guys where these PCI slots and graphics card slots are. Now, these slots, folks, they've got a multi-bus design, which allows different expansion slots on a motherboard. And they do generally have support for older technologies as well. You'll find a lot of them are actually backwards compatible. Now, for the time being, before we move on to the bottom right of the motherboard, and before I show you guys that video, here's just a picture again at the bottom left of the motherboard. There is a better picture of the PCIe slot. So if you look at the top one there, guys, that says times 16, that is your PCIe slot, which we use for the graphics cards. Even though it says PCIe, you get different speeds, you get different versions. You get PCIe 3, PCIe 4, PCI 5. I think 5 is currently the latest version. So depending on the version you've got, that'll dictate which graphics cards and stuff you can go and run. Normally, the newer ports are backwards compatible. So if you've got an old port, it's not forwards compatible, but the newer ports are backwards compatible. So the new stuff is always backwards compatible. You'll find that this one looks like it's got a second graphics card slot as well, which is an older, slower one. So usually most of these other slots will normally be white in color. That's not set in stone in any way, guys. They can actually be any color of the rainbow. But these other slots will usually be white on most motherboards. And we just refer to them as normal PCI slots. You'll normally see them put like a little X times 4 there, which is just to indicate the speed. And you can see obviously there, those small ones, the times 1 one. Those are the small little expansion cards. Now, guys, this whole motherboard concept that I'm explaining to you guys and show you guys, this is in fact questions in exam. It's not just a question exam, it's a PBQ in exam. If you don't know what a PBQ is, that is short for performance-based question. It's a simulation. Now, if you guys don't know, most of your questions in the A+ exam will be theory-based and multiple choice-based. They will ask you a question, and you'll have a choice between 4 possible answers, of which you can usually just choose one. After you've chosen your answer of choice, you'll just move on to the next question. Now, you get a couple of other different kinds of questions, one of which is a PBQ. They'll give you something practical to do. Now, this is a drag and drop PBQ. So in the exam, should you be one of the unfortunate souls that gets this specific simulation, this is not guaranteed, they'll give you a picture of a motherboard, kind of like a cartoon motherboard like the one I've been giving you guys. And on the left-hand side, you'll see a list of components, CPU, RAM, graphics card, that kind of stuff. On the right-hand side, on the motherboard, they'll have empty slots or empty name slots for each component. And your job is going to be to go and drag the correct name to the correct component. So on the left-hand side, you might see the name CPU. Your job would then be to go and drag the name CPU to the correct place on the motherboard to indicate that you know where the CPU is. So it's very important you know where what on the motherboard goes, not just from an exam perspective because they're going to ask you about an exam, but also because of the field, guys. You're probably going to have to go and know how to go and troubleshoot machines and how to go and build machines. So never mind the exam, this is something you guys do need to know, in fact, guys. So please ensure you know where what on the motherboard goes. If you don't feel comfortable with this, I would definitely encourage you guys to go and rewatch this video. Maybe not the whole video, but at least the motherboard section of the video. The part where I explain where what goes on the motherboard. Please make sure you know that for the exam. These PBQs do count for an insane amount of marks in the exam, guys. Should you get the PBQ wrong, there's a very real chance you can fail the exam. Alright, so moving you guys on to the bottom right of the motherboard. Storage bus. Or should I say SATA and IDE. Now IDE, guys, is also known as PATA. P-A-T-A. That is the old concept hard drives and optical drives and stuff. If you look there at the top there of this picture, I know it's at the bottom right of the motherboard, but if you look there at the top, there is an example of an old IDE port. That actually looks like it's going to be for a floppy disk drive because of how small it is. And if I look just to the left there, it looks like it's for either a hard drive or something else. I can't really see in this picture. But that's more or less what you can expect an IDE port to look like. It's going to have a lot of pins. It's going to be a very wide port like that. That's for the old hard drives and optical drives, which we don't get anymore. Those are legacy. They're basically extinct. Just below it, you can see there's the SATA ports. These are facing sideways because it's in line with the graphics card. And if this person happens to slot in a huge graphics card, that graphics card is going to hover over those SATA ports, which means you're not going to be able to use them. If you're going to try and get a cable into them, it's not going to work if you have to put the cable in from the top. Instead, some clever oak said, you know what? What if we go and slide these cables in from the side? And they did just that. Now, the motherboard I'm going to show you guys later, practically, that one, the SATA ports are facing upwards instead of sideways. But in that video, you will see the SATA ports are not completely in line with the graphics card. So it's not the worst thing. One of them is kind of in line, so it's a bit of an issue. But there's quite a lot of them that's still open. So it's not the worst of things. Alright, folks. And then here, we've got other motherboard connectors. You would remember earlier I told you guys, when I showed you guys the front panel connectors, the USB, the mic in, the audio out, that kind of stuff. I told you guys, those cables inside a case are dangling loose. When you buy yourself a new empty shell, a new empty case, it's got a bunch of cables dangling loose, which is for your USB in the front, your audio, your mic and stuff like that. Now, the audio cable usually 9 out of 10 times has audio written on it very clearly. And on the motherboard, somewhere at the bottom right or the bottom left, it's got an audio port. Most motherboards, you'll notice, actually has 2 audio ports. So there'll be somewhere at the bottom right or somewhere at the bottom left. They can actually be right or left. And on the port, it clearly says audio. Audio 1 and audio 2. The same can be said about USB. On the cable from the case, 9 out of 10 times, very clearly on the cable, it'll say USB. And on the motherboard, there's normally 2 USB ports. USB 1 and USB 2. Now, for both the audio and the USB, it does not matter which one you connect it to. As long as you connect audio to any one of the 2 audio ports, it will work. As long as you connect the USB to any one of the 2 USB ports, which are clearly labeled on the motherboard, it will work. Now, at first glance, what you will notice is the audio and the USB cables look the same. The ports look the same. Never mind the naming. Luckily we've got naming, so thank goodness for that. But if you look very closely, guys, you will see each of them has a pin missing. A different pin. So at first glance, it looks like each of these has 10 pins. 2 rows of 5 pins each. But if you look very closely, you'll see the audio has a random pin missing out of those 10 pins. And the USB one has a different pin missing as well. But it's not in the same location. So if the naming on the cable and the motherboard was not good enough for you guys, you can also go and verify this by looking at the pins that's missing. So if you look at the audio jack on the motherboard, you'll see 1 pin is missing. And if you look at the connector that has to plug in there, you'll see one of the ports, one of the little holes, is blanked out, which is going to correspond with the missing pin. Now, before we move on to the next topic, guys, and before I show you guys that video, because that's what's going to be next up, the front panel headers there, way on the right, that is almost always going to be at the bottom right. It's just going to be a question of where at the bottom right you will find this. This is the part that scares most people. It is the most intimidating part for most people. Now, fortunately for you guys, these 4 cables, there's 4 cables by the way, that have to go and connect there, they're very clearly labeled. And 3 out of 4 motherboards are also very clearly labeled. Now, each of these 4 cables are going to go and connect to 2 pins. There's normally on average going to be about 9 pins sticking out, but it might be more. But there will be at least 9 pins. Like I said, could be more, but there'll be at least 9 pins. Each of the 4 connectors can only connect to 2 of these pins, so there's always going to be a spare pin, if you want to call it that. So one of these connector cables coming from your case will normally say something along the lines of power switch. It'll say power SW for power switch, or it'll outright say power switch, but something along the lines of power switch. And on the motherboard, next to those pins, it'll often also say power switch or power SW for power switch. Now folks, if you're not sure on the motherboard which pins, it's normally the top 2 right ones. So if you look at the image that I've got there, that'll be the bottom of the motherboard. The pin connectors, the front panel connectors, are the bottom right. Now looking at from that angle, the top right pins, the top 2 right ones, those are normally power pins. The top 2 left pins are the power LED pins. The bottom 2 left pins are normally hard drive LED pins. And the bottom 2 right pins will normally be the reset button. So I would suggest maybe starting at the bottom left 2 pins. Way at the bottom left, those 2 pins are hard drive LED. HDD space LED. And then the bottom 2 right ones, so on the right, way at the bottom, that will be the reset button. It will say reset switch or restart button, something along those lines, but normally it will say reset switch. So reset switch is the bottom 2 right pins normally. It will probably be a blue cable in most cases, not guaranteed, but from experience I can tell you it's usually going to be blue. The top 2 right pins directly above the reset switch is the power switch. So that's normally going to be a red cable in most cases. Also not set in stone, it's just usually. And the top 2 left pins are usually power LED. So where I've told you guys where these pins are not set in stone, it's just usually from experience, those pins are for those things I've just elaborated on. But just to confirm, I would say check on the motherboard. You'll find it 3 out of 4 motherboards. On the motherboard, right next to the pins, it'll tell you which pins are for what. And if you're still not sure, you can go run a search on Google or whatever for that motherboard's make and model, and it'll very clearly indicate which pins are for what, and then you can just go and confirm. Now the power switch, guys, that's just for the power button in the front. So in reality, if you were to go and take a very small flat screwdriver and you were to go and touch those 2 pins where the power connector is supposed to go and connect, the PC would actually start. I would not encourage you to go and do that because, on some motherboards, it's very sensitive, and if you go do that, you'll actually blow the motherboard. But if you have an old motherboard you're willing to sacrifice, and if you want to show off in front of your friends and family, you can go and do that, and you'll see the PC is actually going to start, assuming it doesn't blow the motherboard. The reset switch is for restart button. It speaks for itself. The HDD LED is the hard drive light. Now some of the older computer cases have got some sort of light in the front. It can either be orange or green. And depending on how active your hard drive was back in the day, this light would flash accordingly. So if you're doing an antivirus scan or an installation or you're copying or cutting something huge, this light would basically stay consistent. It'll just stay solid. It will stay on. But if you're doing a small copy or something, lightweight on your hard drive, it'll just flicker a little bit. That's basically all it does. It's got no real significance. My opinion is you don't even need to go and plug that in. And then the power LED is all the lights in the front of the case. So some of the older gaming cases and stuff, or the normal office PCs, they've got lights in the front. So if you go and press the power button, you might find that the power button's got some sort of little light that'll come on, or there'll be 1 or 2 little lights in the front of the case coming on, just to indicate to the user that the machine is actually on. With gaming computers, we obviously don't need that because you've got all kinds of fans. You can see them spinning, and they probably have RGB in them, which means that you've got fancy colored lights in them and all that. So you can very clearly see and hear of a gaming PC when it's on. But if it's an old, normal office computer, yeah, if you press the power button, unless you hear the fans, you might not know that it's on. So if the power button could at least light up in some sort of way, that's a nice indicator for the user to show, hey, look, this machine is on. And that's basically what the idea was. Alright folks, and then before we move on to the next topic, I want to show you guys on a real motherboard what it actually looks like when we go and look at these components. Now what I'm going to show you guys is an old ATX motherboard, so it's got some old, ports on it, like IDE ports and whatnot. So it's not the worst motherboard, but it's definitely not the latest motherboard, unfortunately. But it should still give you a fairly good idea of, what you're in for, and that's the kind of stuff they'll ask you in the exam. The motherboard I'm about to show you is the kind of motherboard you can expect them to ask you about in the exam. It's the same ports that will ask you about in the exam. So that being said, let me switch over to that motherboard.
A few moments later.
Alright folks, here is that motherboard I spoke of. I'm going to start you guys off the CPU. There is the CPU socket. This is for Intel CPUs. There is your RAM slots. I've got 2 of them. Some might have 4 slots for the RAM. Here is your graphics card slot. It says PCIe. And then here is your PCIe slots for Wi-Fi cards, modems, and that kind of stuff. Here at the bottom, there is your PATA ports. Left is for floppy. Right hand side here, you can see that's for hard drives and stuff. Those are extinct, by the way. And then here on the right hand side, there's your SATA ports. Mine are facing upwards. Some motherboards face sideways, but mine is not in the way of the graphics card, so it's not an issue. Here at the bottom left, let me just zoom in. There's your front panel audio. You can see mine's purple, but the color doesn't matter. And then here on the right hand side, let me just get it into focus. If you look at those yellow ports, USB 1 and USB 2. So this motherboard has 2 ports for USB. It does not matter which one you go and connect to if it only has 1 cable. Some motherboards will have 2 USB ports, some will have 1. There's the front panel. Those little connectors I spoke of with the start button, the restart button, and LED lights and stuff. The one that gives people, fear and all that. Way here at the top, guys, there is where you're going to go and connect your CPU's fan or your liquid cooling system. So it says CPU fan or liquid cooling system. Here's where you're going to go and connect your CPU's power. That's a P4. Some motherboards need way more, and it'll be here at the top left-hand side. Let me open this CPU latch for you guys. I'm going to go and open it up for you guys, and then I'm going to go and install the CPU. I'll just briefly show you guys. So generally, a good rule of thumb would be to hover the CPU over the CPU port and to check where on the sides of the CPU you see little holes. And then just inside the port, you just go and check where little pieces of plastic sticking out. Alternatively, you can go check for a missing pin inside the hole, and you just go and look for a little copper arrow. There's a little copper arrow. The copper arrow will always point towards the missing pin inside the port. But the easiest way for most people is just to hover the CPU over the hole. And I'll get it into focus for you guys now. As soon as you hover it over the hole, you just check where the missing holes in the CPU are and where they align with the little pieces of plastic sticking out on the sides. You can see mine, bottom left, bottom right, I've got little holes in the CPU. You can see there if I bring it closer. Bottom left, bottom right, there's little holes in the CPU. And inside this hole, if you check closely, left and right at the bottom, there's little pieces of plastic sticking out. So all I need to do is just hover it gently over the hole, gently drop this sucker into place. There we go. Gonna close the latch now. There we go. Gonna close the latch, close the lever, hook it into place. All it's left to do now is to apply thermal paste or thermal compound on top of the CPU. Then you can go put your heatsink or your liquid cooling system on top of it. And let me just put some RAM chips in here as well. So the RAM chips, guys, you'll see they can only go in one way, assuming you've got the right RAM. There's a little piece of plastic there, you can see the hole. That basically confirms that you've got your RAM chip in correctly. If you've got it the wrong way around, it's not going to go in. There's a little hole inside the RAM chip as well. Indentation. So I'm going to hover it there for you guys again. You can see this one's the wrong way around. It's not going to work. You see it's misaligned. So I'm going to turn this around. There we go. It aligns. So now I'm going to shove it in there. While it's open, you can see on the two top sides, top and bottom, it's open. You just press down. It's going to click into place automatically. You can hear it and feel it click into place on both sides. And that's it, guys. As simple as that. More on this later.
One eternity later.
Right, guys, the next topic, as you can see, storage connector types. So I've got a bit of a picture for you guys here of a normal old school hard drive. So I suppose you could say this is the old mechanical hard drive, so some of you guys might know it. And if you look there at the connectors, that should look familiar to you guys. Earlier, we spoke about the cables that you would go and plug into a hard drive. I showed you guys the data cable, and I showed you guys the power cable that would normally go and connect to the hard drive. I told you guys the other end of this data cable would go and connect to your motherboard, and the other end of that power cable would obviously be connected to your power supply. If you don't remember what these cables looked like, there's a bit of a reminder for you guys. So this is for your hard drives that you would go and put, randomly loose somewhere in your case. These are, however, becoming less and less common nowadays. People are more keen on using normal solid state drives nowadays, or they'll go and use one of those hard drives that looks like a card that you go and slide into your motherboard. We normally slide them into the .M2 slots, if you guys know what those are. Now, if you guys are not sure what the M2 slot is, let me show you guys a more modern motherboard. So here is a picture of the motherboard I've got in one of my PCs at home. So I built a new gaming PC here for one of my kids. And this is the MSI Pro B650-S Wi-Fi motherboard. It's a very modern motherboard. It's not a too high spec motherboard, but it's a decent entry level budget motherboard for gaming PCs. Now this is an AMD motherboard, guys. This is for AMD CPUs. It's an AM5, so it's compatible with some of the latest AMD CPUs there. So So the CPU I put in case anyone is curious for my kids, is the Ryzen 9800 X3D chip, which is the highest spec gaming CPU you can get at this point in time. So it's just really, really a top dog. So obviously by the time you guys watch this video, depending on when you watch it, it might no longer be the top CPU, because these manufacturers like Intel and AMD and all of them are obviously constantly developing and releasing new stuff. But at the time of the making of this video, this was currently the most powerful gaming CPU on the market, was the AMD 9800 X3D with its gaming cache and all that. So first of all, guys, this is a bit of an overview of a motherboard. If you look here at the bottom, guys, bottom left, there's two M.2 slots. One of them is beneath this heatsink. Yes, that's a heatsink. It's removable. And the other one is here at the bottom. It's kind of open. The one that's underneath the heatsink is because it's going to be directly below the graphics card. And as you guys probably know, a graphics card can get quite hot. So this one's got a heatsink. But a lot of these little hard drives that you go and slide into these slots, they actually come with their own little heatsink, some of them. And if I want to, I can go put a second hard drive in here. So at the moment I only have one, which is underneath that heatsink. And if I really want to, I can go put a second one in if I want to for the kids as well. In terms of the CPU, guys, you can see there's the CPU slot there. It's got a plastic cover, so it doesn't matter if this is an Intel CPU or an AMD CPU. The motherboard normally has a plastic cover. So you're going to open that latch first, like I showed you guys earlier in real time. You're going to go and drop your CPU in there very gently after you've confirmed it's aligned correctly. You're going to close it. You don't even have to bother that plastic flap. It'll automatically shoot off. You know, trust me, it will. In terms of random access memory, we showed you guys how to go and insert it. You can see on this motherboard, there is 4 slots. And we're not going to start the slot closest to the CPU. Instead, we're going to start at the second closest slot to the CPU. So that will be the second one from the left there. We're going to start at that slot first. And then the second RAM chip goes into the last slot there, way on the right. So we're going to go and put the RAM chips into slot 2 and slot 4. Which is exactly what I did with this motherboard for the kids. I put RAM into slot 2 and slot 4. I didn't put in too much RAM. I didn't put in just 32 gigs because everybody puts in 32 gigs. I put in 48 gigs. I probably could have gone and put in 2 sticks of 32 gigs RAMs each. This motherboard does support up to 192 gigs of RAM if I really want to. But I don't need more than that. I didn't want to put in just 32 gigs because that's going to get outdated quite quick. So I boosted them a little bit more. I put in 2 chips of 24 gigs each. So it's got 48 gigs, which is 2 sticks. And that's in slot 2 and slot 4 respectively. So this motherboard, if you look there, I know you guys can't see clear in this image, but there's actually a picture that shows you which slots to fill in first. Now for you guys it might be blurry, but if you were to zoom in on this picture, it actually would have shown you there, slot 2 and slot 4 should be filled first. It actually tells you which slots to go and fill first. I mean, how cool is that? As for PCI-Express, this motherboard has got 2 slots. There is the first one, which is the main one, which is the only one that most people are going to be using. Way here at the bottom is the secondary graphics card slot. Yeah, that's the second one. You'll notice there's no normal PCI slots besides this small little mini one here, which is the ×1 PCI slot. It depends on what you want to do, but a lot of the new modern motherboards these days, they don't come out with normal PCI slots. They don't. Instead, they only come out of PCIe slots. If you want a PCI slot, a normal one, you're going to probably have to pay extra for that because nobody wants that. So yeah, in terms of PCI, this one only has this small little mini one here at the bottom, the one that's ×1. The CMOS battery, you can see on this motherboard, is at the bottom right. The picture I showed you guys earlier, that little animation, the CMOS battery was where? It was at the bottom left. But this one is at the bottom right. So I told you guys, it can either be at the bottom left or the bottom right. I suppose in reality it can probably be anywhere on the motherboard, but almost all motherboards, you'll always find the CMOS battery at the bottom left or the bottom right. As for the front panel headers, there they are, they're the bottom right. That's the front panel headers, guys. It's usually going to be somewhere in the vicinity of the bottom right of the motherboard. As for the power connectors, here on the right hand side, almost always on all motherboards, here on the right hand side, you will find your 24-pin motherboard connector. That is the main power for your motherboard, guys. So on your power supply, you'll find only one such connector. It's got 24 pins. You always hook it here on the right hand side. As for the CPU power, earlier I showed you guys where the CPU power was. It was directly below the CPU or right next to the CPU. It was a P4 connector of only 4 pins. Now that's the old motherboards. The newer ones like this one, you'll find at the top left, they'll have one or more connector. This one has got two 8-pin connectors. It needs a lot of juice for the CPU because this CPU is obviously one of the most powerful CPUs to get on the market. So for all these powerful CPUs, you need a lot of juice. So those two connectors at the top left, that's for the CPU, guys. And it goes without saying you're going to need a special power supply that has these connectors. Not all power supplies come with those connectors. As for USB connectors, guys, this motherboard has two USB connectors. A USB 1 and a USB 2. It's up to you which one you want to go and use, so that it really doesn't matter. And just to remind you guys, the cables are labeled. Let me show you guys. You can see here, this cable, this is that same motherboard from earlier, it's labeled. It says USB. And your job is just to go and put it on the right place on the motherboard. As for audio connectors, guys, audio connectors, also on the motherboard, you'll normally have one or two connectors. The motherboard I showed you guys earlier had only one connector, but they might potentially have two or more. So you can see here on this cable from earlier, this cable clearly says audio. Your job is just to go look on the motherboard where it also says audio. As simple as that, guys. As for fan connector, if you look at this motherboard here, it's got 3 of them. One of them says CPU fan, one says system fan, the other one just says fan in general. So some motherboards only have one. This one's got a lot of fan connectors. Here on the right hand side, there's another fan connector. Here on the left hand side, there's another fan connector. So in total, right off the bat, I see about 5 on this motherboard, I think. So at the top, there's 3. Here on the right, there's 1. And here at the bottom left, or in the middle left, there's also 1. So the one there way on the right and the one way there on the left, those are normal case fan connectors. And the ones at the top, that's for CPU fan, system fan. So where mine says CPU fan, I went and connected a liquid cooling system. Because of how, powerful the CPU is and how hot it gets, I need to cool this sucker properly. So instead of opting for a normal heatsink or a normal fan, I'm cooling this bugger with a liquid cooling system. I'll show you guys what that looks like once we get to liquid cooling systems and stuff. And of course, then I'll show you maybe guys a little video of what this PC of this motherboard actually looks like with the liquid cooling. You guys can see firsthand how that actually works and how I connected it. As for RGB connectors, now these gaming motherboards, guys, they've got a connector on the motherboard which looks very much the same as the fans. It's for RGB. If you don't know what the RGB is, that's the lights. All of these gaming PCs, in the fans in the case, you'll find that they've got lights in the fans. Some of them are constant, it'll be a consistent red or a consistent blue or purple, but most of these fans are able to change multiple colors. That's the RGB. You can go look up what that actually is. So a lot of these cases, they've got RGB. If you look at the RAM that goes into these gaming motherboards, the RAM themselves actually have lights on them, believe it or not, that changes all kinds of colors. The RAM I put on this motherboard is RGB RAM. It's not just fast gaming RAM. The RAM has got all kinds of fancy lights. So the RAM actually glows on the motherboard. The whole freaking case I put everything in glows. Everything just glows. The graphics card glows. Everything has got RGB. And that needs to be connected to the motherboard so that you can go and control the colors of all of this. Alright guys, and then as for the expansion cards, which I've mentioned quite a few times, so that would be something like a modem, a sound card, a Wi-Fi card. More than likely you guys are not going to be using this, but an expansion card, guys, is a printed circuit board that is installed in a slot on a system board. This is normally your PCI slot, and it's to provide special functions for customizing or extending your computer's capabilities. This is also referred to as an adapter card, an I/O card, in other words, an input-output card, an add-in, an add-on, or just a board. But most of us will just call this an expansion card. So these input-output adapters or storage cards, guys, like I said, this could be something like a sound card. That'll be an example of an output card. It could be maybe an additional external network card. So this could be a NIC maybe, network interface card. Most motherboards, including laptops, already have an RJ45 port, which is your normal network cable. If you look at a laptop, they actually have 2 NICs. One of them is for the RJ45 port, which is where you would normally go and plug in your LAN cable, in other words, your normal network cable. And the other network card is the wireless one that allows your laptop to connect wirelessly. But if you look at the fancy new gaming computer cases, a lot of them actually have wireless capability. So they technically have 2 network cards too, if you think about it. Alright folks, that brings us finally to the end of the second main section. And we're going to move into the third and the last main section. Now guys, this is the point of the video where I like to play a game with my audience. Most of you guys would know what this game is by now. I normally give you a secret word or a secret phrase. Now folks, this is completely optional. You do not need to play this game, but if you'd like to play along, the secret word for today is peanut butter. I kid you not. Now the idea here for you guys is to either go and type the word as is in the comment section down below, but that alone is not so much fun. Or you can take the word or the phrase, today it's just a word, and you can go and make a sentence with that word. If at all possible, try and keep it to IT. Now this is next to impossible, meaning the word peanut butter obviously has nothing to do with IT. But let's see how creative you guys can be. Make a sentence with the word peanut butter, but try and associate it somehow with IT. Let's see how creative you guys can be. Now, never mind that, what also makes this fun is anybody that's now reading through the comment section that has not watched the video up until this point, they're going to be massively confused. They're going to be wondering, why are people talking about peanut butter and this or that? They're going to be massively confused. So only for people that's actually watched the video up until this point, only you guys would know what this is all about. So it's a bit of an inside game with a bit of an inside joke. Now you can of course still go and drop your normal comments down below. So if you've got a question about something in this specific module, guys, by all means, ask your question down below and I will gladly answer you guys as soon as I possibly can. You can alternatively also join my Discord server. The link is literally the very last link in the video description. You can go join the Discord server. It's a free server. I'm in there. Other ID trainers are in there. And other people studying for the A+ course are also in there. So please, by all means, join the Discord server. It's completely for free. If you've got questions, you're more than welcome to go and ask your questions there. Or you can just go and ask them below. Or you can do it both. You can ask it in the Discord server. And you can go and ask it in the comment section. It's really your choice, guys. Alright, folks. Let's move on to the last section. Legacy cables. So the word legacy means something is old. This can be hardware. It can be software. So if it's hardware, it could be something like the old IDE hard drives. Those are legacy. Or it can be cables, like an integrated drive electronics cable. In other words, IDE cable, also known as a PCI cable. So there's a picture obviously for you guys of what these look like. The chances are very unlikely that you guys are not going to see these. You're not going to see these cables. They're basically extinct. So the old computers used to have these. You could normally plug up to 2 of them onto the motherboard, and they would allow you to connect up to 4 devices in total. So it's one end of the cable connects to the motherboard. Each cable had 2 connectors. You could go and connect 2 optical drives, 2 hard drives, or a combination of 1 hard drive and 1 optical drive on one of these cables. You'll see there's a little colored strip there. So in the picture there it's pink. That is pin 1. These cables normally consisted of 40 pins or 80 pins. 80 pins was the more common one. And the pink strip is normally pin 1. That is just to indicate which side needs to face towards you. So if you've got the side panel the case off, the colored strip always faces towards you. That was just to indicate. Now, this cable, obviously, as you guys can see, is gray. But in reality, just like the SATA cable from earlier, they could actually be any color of the rainbow. Mine used to be black, and pin 1 used to be white. But the cable itself can be any color of the rainbow. Pin 1 could be any color of the rainbow. At the end of the day, the cable could only go and plug in one way on the motherboard. So there was no incorrect way of plugging it in. If you try to plug it in the wrong way, it simply just would not go in. If you're wondering what I'm talking about, there's a bit of a picture of a very old motherboard of what this used to look like. If you want to go and plug this on the motherboard, you can see there's a pin missing. And there used to be a little click side. So if you look at this cable there on the right, you can see it's got a little piece of plastic sticking out. And if you look at the port there, you can see there's a little piece of plastic missing. So there's only one way it could go in. Both of those actually has a piece of plastic missing. The black one is a bit quite hard to see. But the black port and the blue port both have a piece of plastic missing. And on the cable there, you can see it's got a piece of plastic sticking out. So the cable could only go in one way. If you tried to plug it in the wrong way, it would not work, guys. As for the hard drive, that's what the hard drives used to look like. So at the bottom left there, guys, that is where you would go and plug that sucker in. And on the bottom right there, that's where you would go and plug in that Molex connector we spoke of way earlier in the video. That's where the Molex connector would have gone. Right, folks, still on the topic of legacy cables, let's talk about serial cables. These cables, you know, the ports on the motherboards for laptops and desktops are extinct. So if you go look at a standard laptop or a standard desktop PC these days, you will not come across these ports anymore. Yet, we still use these cables very commonly. Now, where do we use these cables, you ask? Well, guys, you're going to use them as server room. These cables are also referred to as a console cable. They're also referred to as a rollover cable. Not something we actually teach in A+, not something they'll ask you in the A+ exam. That is something they might possibly ask you in the N+ exam, more commonly in the Cisco exam if any of you guys are going to go and do CCNA, you know, Cisco and stuff like that. But just food for thought, it's also called a console cable. It's also called a rollover cable. So if you are in a server room, and if you guys ever seen a server room, there's all kinds of devices in the server room. And you sometimes need to configure these devices. Now for you to do that, you'll normally go and take a laptop in, because laptops are just easier to carry around. But the cable you're going to plug into this device, the part that plugs into the device is going to look like a normal Net2 cable. It's going to look like it's got an RJ45 connector. Now that's called a console cable. That's normally the more common name we use. But the part of the cable that plugs into your laptop or desktop looks like what we see in front of us. That part, you know, it looks like that. We call that a serial interface, a COM port. So it's called an RS232 interface. It's also called a DB9 connector. It's also called a COM port. It's also called a serial interface or a serial port. It's got so many names, guys. It's enough to make you nauseous. These ports, many moons ago, they used to be also used for, you know, normal PS2 keyboards and mouses. But it's been like 15, 20 years, if not more, since I've seen people use it for that. So they're only used for devices and server rooms these days. Now, since that's what the port looks like that we need to go and connect to our laptop, how do we connect that to our laptop if our laptop does not have a connector like that? We are going to go and use what we call an adapter, guys. Sometimes these adapters are like small little cables that are about the length of your hand or your length of your arm. One side of the connector might be USB, or it might be an RJ45 or something along those lines. The other part of the connector will be something like what we see in front of us. It's to convert one interface into another. Most commonly, we use these converter cables or adapters for video. So I can go and convert DVI to VGA, HDMI to VGA, or whatever. They're more common with video, but we can go and convert serial to something like USB or whatever as well. And that's normally what we do in these server room environments. Then, folks, another cable we get is SCSI. We just refer to this as SCSI, but the actual official name is actually Small Computer System Interface, more commonly known as SCSI for short. So this is normally also found more commonly in server room environments. They are kind of, you know, extinct now at this point in time. I suppose you will still find them in some server rooms, the very old server rooms. So this interface is absolute, guys. Might still be found in unreplaceable legacy systems. So if you are in a server room which has got very old servers, yes, you might still find it there. These old systems, guys, might run some bespoke applications which are too risky to try and swap out. So there's a chance that some company might have some very old application and there's nothing new in the market. They've got to run that application. There's no other version out there. There's no equivalent out there. And in those cases, you might find them still using these old cables, which we call SCSI. Very, very old stuff. So chances are you might never actually see these guys. Alright, folks, and then the last topic I'm going to talk to you guys about today, which is something we did briefly mention, is adapter cables. They could be cables, or it could be a little adapter that fits in the palm of your hand. Then the more common ones, like I said, is to convert one type of video feed to another. To convert HDMI to VGA, or HDMI to DVI. You know, that's the more common ones. Or VGA to DVI. Now, you do get other ones as well, you know, which can go and convert, let's say, serial to USB. You know, for instance, like we said earlier. So these are passive cables with different connectors on each end. Then you also get active cables with circuitry to translate signaling between different interface types. If we look at the common one I spoke about earlier, video. That could be HDMI to VGA. It could be HDMI to DisplayPort. DisplayPort, you'll often see people just referring to it as DP. It could be HDMI to DVI. And if you look at USB, USB is also a common one. This could be USB Type C to USB Type A. You could go and maybe, you know, split this into a USB hub. This could be USB to Thunderbolt or USB to Lightning. Something we spoke about earlier when we spoke about Thunderbolt cables or Lightning cables, guys. Alright, folks, I really hope you've learned something in Module 2 of A+. We've still got a lot of modules. We've still got 20 modules to go. Remember, the course consists of 22 modules. This is only Module 2. So if you'd like to know when module 3 comes out, please remember to subscribe to the channel. And remember to also give this video a like. It does help the video. It does help the channel when you guys do that. Now, before we conclude this video, guys, a special shout out and thank you to the people supporting the channel. Thank you to all the people making PayPal donations in the background. Obviously, those of you also making normal donations, buying me coffee and milkshake. Thank you to those as well. And by the way, if you want to support the channel, you can find all that information in the video description down below. Then, of course, guys, the Patreons. The Patreons. Guys, thank you very, very much for your donations. If you would like to become a Patreon, please go check out my Patreon. There's 3 plans to go and choose from at the time of the making of this video. Most of them are very cheap, and you actually do get extra courseware on there, which is not on my YouTube channel. So if you're looking for additional A+ courseware, chances are you're going to find it on my Patreon, guys. So please feel free to go and check out my Patreon for additional courseware that's not on YouTube. And if you do become a paid Patreon, I'll normally ask you if you would want to have your name displayed here on this page. It's completely optional. Most people opt to stay anonymous, but if you want to have your name displayed here, just let me know. I will normally ask you, and if you say yes, you can choose the name that gets displayed. It does not have to be a real name. You can go and choose a nickname or something else if you want to. And then lastly, folks, for those of you that don't know, the channel does have a Discord server. I did mention it earlier in the video. That's literally the very last link in the video description, so go and check it out. It's for people that's like-minded, like you. It's other people studying A+, N+, Security+, and other courses. So if you want to ask questions, you can go and ask them there. Either myself, or one of the other IT trainers, or one of the other students will answer you. And if you know the answer to somebody else's question, you can obviously go and answer that person as well. Maybe you just want to join a study group. We do have study groups there as well, so if you want to join a study group, check it out, guys. The link is in the video description. It's completely for free. No reason not to do it. Alright, folks, I will see you in Module 3 of the CompTIA A+ course.